Sheriff Jonas Crowley has long been the embodiment of justice. Yet behind his authoritative demeanor lies a secret that threatens to upend everything he has worked so hard to build. His influence, carefully cultivated over years of service, is now being used to shield a truth he desperately wants to keep hidden. If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, inhumanity, abuse to mention a few, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you. Working closely by his side is Deputy Jake Turner, a loyal partner whose dedication to duty and friendship has always been unwavering. Jake's presence on the force is a beacon of reliability, a man whose commitment to protecting the community is matched only by his devotion to his family. Unbeknownst to him, however, a storm is brewing in his personal life. Married to Veronica Turner, he cherishes every moment of their seemingly ordinary existence. Their bond, formed over countless shared experiences and late-night conversations on patrol, is about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Veronica Bishop stands at the center of this tangled web, a woman caught between the life she knows and a dangerous allure that promises escape. Her beauty and vulnerability have made her a coveted confidant, and it is in the quiet, secret hours of the night that she finds herself drawn to a forbidden connection. Each encounter is charged with a tension that grows heavier with every stolen moment, until the burden of guilt and risk becomes too overwhelming to ignore. As the clandestine meetings progress, a series of choices are set in motion that will irrevocably alter the course of all their lives. In the solitude of darkened rooms and over the hum of empty streets, Mark and Veronica share secrets that blur the lines between right and wrong. The thrill of the forbidden offers them a brief respite from the mundane, yet every moment of passion is laced with the danger of discovery. The quiet rhythm of small-town life, with its familiar faces and predictable routines, becomes the perfect stage for a drama of epic proportions. It is during one of these stolen nights that the weight of their deception presses in on Mark. With every whispered conversation and every lingering touch, the possibility of exposure grows too real to ignore. In a moment of cold calculation, Mark comes to a chilling conclusion. The only way to ensure that his hidden life remains buried is to eliminate the one person who could bring everything crashing down, his trusted partner, Deputy Jake Turner. This realization, dark and irrevocable, sets the wheels of a sinister plan in motion. The stage is now set in a town where every familiar corner hides a potential clue. Every quiet street masks a secret rendezvous, and every passing moment is fraught with the tension of what might come next. As the night deepens, the calm of routine transforms into a backdrop for a conspiracy that will test the very limits of loyalty and honor. The ordinary becomes extraordinary as the lives of these three individuals spiral into a dangerous dance of betrayal and retribution. In the coming minutes, we will peel back the layers of this intricate case, a narrative woven from desire, deceit, and the desperate measures taken to protect a life built on lies. How far will a man go to hide the truth? And at what cost does the pursuit of forbidden passion come? This is the beginning of a story where every decision carries weight, and the line between justice and corruption blurs into a haze of regret and irreversible choices. Sheriff Jonas Crowley had always been a man in control of his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed image as a protector of the law. But now, that control was slipping through his fingers. The affair with Veronica Bishop, his partner's wife, which had once been an exhilarating escape from the monotony of his life, had become a noose tightening around his neck. Every stolen moment, every hushed conversation, had transformed into a liability that threatened to destroy everything he had built. He saw it in Jake's lingering glances, in the unspoken tension at work, in Veronica's shifting demeanor. She was changing, becoming more distant, more erratic, almost as if she was carrying the weight of a decision she hadn't yet voiced. The fear gnawed at him. What if she confessed? What if, in a moment of guilt or desperation, she told Jake everything? The consequences were unthinkable. If the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just cost Mark his career, it would obliterate his entire life. His wife, his children, his standing in the community, all of it would be stripped away, leaving him with nothing but disgrace and regret. The affair had been reckless, but a public scandal would be catastrophic. Worse, Jake wouldn't just walk away if he found out. A man like Jake, a man of principle and loyalty, wouldn't suffer this betrayal in silence. He would act. Mark considered ending the affair, cutting ties with Veronica and walking away before the situation spiraled further. But the moment he thought of it, another, far more terrifying thought took root. Veronica wouldn't let him. He knew her too well. If she felt abandoned, if she sensed him pulling away, she might lash out. She might seek comfort in the one person who could bring his entire world crashing down. He couldn't allow that to happen. That's when the dark thought crept in. A solution so absolute, so final, that once it entered his mind, it refused to leave. If Jake was gone, the threat would disappear. No confrontation, no scandal, no ruined career, just silence. At first, the idea repulsed him. He was a sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law, not break it. But the more he considered it, the more it began to feel not just possible, but necessary. If Jake was out of the picture, everything could go back to normal. He could continue his life as it was meant to be, his affair with Veronica buried in the past, a secret neither of them would ever have to acknowledge again. But how? A cop's murder, especially one as well respected as Jake, would trigger an investigation that could lead back to him if he wasn't careful. It had to be done right, clean, precise, with no loose ends. And for that, he needed someone willing to pull the trigger for him. Through back channels in the murky shadows where criminals whispered of things that couldn't be spoken aloud, Mark made a connection. A man known only by a first name. Someone with no official records, no ties to anything traceable. A hitman, a ghost in the system. The kind of man who made problems disappear for a price. The arrangement was simple. Mark would provide details, Jake's schedule, his habits, the moments when he was most vulnerable. A staged robbery, a tragic car accident, a fatal break-in at the wrong place, wrong time. The hitman offered options, all of them designed to look like an unfortunate twist of fate. The price was steep, but for Mark, it wasn't just money he was paying. It was for peace of mind, for security, for survival. As the plan took shape, Mark felt the tension ease ever so slightly. He had control again. He had a solution. All that remained was execution. But what Mark didn't know was that his carefully planned crime had already started to unravel. The man Mark Crowley had chosen for the job was no amateur. He was an ex-con with a history of violence. His name was Vince Mercer, a career criminal who had spent more time behind bars than outside of them. Aggravated assault, armed robbery, even whispers of previous contract killings, all part of a past that never quite left him. For Vince, this wasn't about loyalty or revenge. It wasn't personal. It was business. And business, when it involved a desperate man like Jonas Crowley, meant easy money. The meeting took place in a roadside diner off the beaten path. Crowley arrived first, his palms slick with sweat, his heartbeat an erratic drumbeat in his chest. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, but nothing could prepare him for the moment he'd have to say it out loud. Ordering a black coffee he had no intention of drinking, he sat in a booth near the back, facing the door. His badge was tucked away, his service weapon left behind. Tonight he wasn't Sheriff Jonas Crowley. Tonight he was just a man with a problem that needed fixing. Vince entered a few minutes later, his presence like a cold wind cutting through the warmth of the diner. Tall, wiry, with a face lined by years of hard living, he moved with the kind of ease that came from knowing he could handle himself in any situation. Dressed in a worn leather jacket, his boots scuffed from years of running, he slid into the booth across from Crowley without a word. For a moment, there was silence. Just the sound of the jukebox, the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Then, Vince leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You Crowley?" Crowley nodded, his throat dry. "You got a job. I got a price. Let's hear it." The words were spoken without hesitation, as if Vince were discussing the weather. Crowley swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the hitman's gaze. "There's a man. A cop. Deputy Jake Bishop." He hesitated only a second before continuing. He needs to disappear. Vince tilted his head slightly, studying Crowley with something between amusement and curiosity. Disappear? That's a fancy way of saying you want him dead. Crowley clenched his jaw. Yeah. The ex-con leaned back, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. Cops are tricky. Lot of eyes on them. Lot of paperwork when one goes missing. He tapped his fingers against the table. But for the right price, tricky don't mean impossible. Crowley reached into his jacket, pulling out a thick envelope. He slid it across the table, careful not to make any sudden movements. Vince picked it up, flipping through the stack of crisp $100 bills. This is half, Crowley said, his voice low but firm. The rest when it's done. Vince smirked, tucking the envelope into his jacket. All right, Sheriff, you got yourself a deal. But it wasn't over yet. The money was just part of the transaction. Now came the details, the logistics that would turn a desperate man's request into a reality. Crowley pulled a small notepad from his pocket, flipping to a page filled with notes. He works late shifts, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and every other Saturday. He parks in the department lot, but sometimes he stops at a bar before heading home. Place called Murphy's. That's when he's alone. Vince nodded, absorbing the information. Blind spots? There's a section behind the bar, no cameras. If you wait there, you'll have a clean shot before he even knows what's happening. Vince considered this, tapping a finger against the table. Gun or blade? Crowley hesitated. The question was chilling in its casual nature. He wasn't just planning a murder, he was planning the method of execution. Gun, he said finally. Quick, no suffering. Vince smirked. You got a soft heart, Sheriff. Most guys don't care how messy it gets long as it's done. Crowley clenched his fists under the table. It has to look like a robbery gone wrong, no connections back to me. Then I'll need his wallet, his watch. Something that makes it look legit, Vince said. What's he drive? Black Chevy Silverado. He parks in the back corner of Murphy's lot. Vince nodded. All right, I'll tail him for a couple days, make sure the routine checks out. Then I'll take care of it. Crowley exhaled, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Vince finished the last of his coffee, then slid out of the booth. I'll be in touch. As Crowley watched the hitman walk out into the night, disappearing into the shadows, he felt a momentary relief. Soon this nightmare would be over. But what Crowley didn't realize was that he had just set into motion a chain of events he could no longer control. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air had a bite to it and the streets were quieter than usual. The hum of a distant siren, the occasional gust of wind rustling fallen leaves, these were the only sounds that accompanied Deputy Jake Bishop as he stepped out of Murphy's bar. Jake had been there for a little over an hour, nursing a beer but never finishing it, staring at his phone, deep in thought. Lately, something had felt off. Crowley had been acting strange, distracted, evasive. Veronica too. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the gut feeling wouldn't leave him. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before sliding his phone into his pocket. His patrol shift had ended, but duty never really stopped. A call had come in earlier, nothing major, just a report of a possible trespasser on the outskirts of town. Normally, he would have ignored it, but tonight, he needed the distraction. As he stepped into the parking lot, the cold seeped through his jacket, making him shiver. The lot was mostly empty now, just a handful of cars parked under dim streetlights. His black Chevy Silverado sat in its usual spot, tucked into the back corner near the alley. It was quiet. Too quiet. Jake didn't notice the shadow lingering in the alleyway, watching, waiting. Vince Mercer had been patient. He had spent the past few nights studying Jake's routine, learning his habits, his movements. Tonight, everything had lined up perfectly. The deputy was alone, no backup, no witnesses, a clean hit. He adjusted the black mask over his face, the cold steel of the gun resting heavy in his grip. The plan was simple. Step out, one shot to the chest, grab the wallet, and disappear. A staged robbery. Quick and clean. As Jake approached his truck, he reached for his keys. Then he hesitated. A noise. Soft, almost imperceptible. A shift in the air. His instincts screamed at him, but before he could react, a figure emerged from the darkness. A gun raised, a flash of muzzle fire. The gunshot shattered the silence of the night. Jake staggered backward, pain exploding in his chest as the bullet tore through him. His breath hitched, his vision blurred. The world tilted. He collapsed onto the pavement, gasping, his body screaming in protest. Vince moved quickly, crouching beside him, rifling through his pockets. He grabbed the wallet, yanked the watch off Jake's wrist. Blood pooled beneath the deputy's body, spreading in a dark, glistening stain across the concrete. It should have been over. But then, a ragged breath, a faint groan. Jake wasn't dead. His pulse was weak, but it was there. He was still clinging to life. Vince cursed under his breath. This wasn't part of the plan. A clean hit, Crowley had said. No mistakes, no loose ends. But now Vince was faced with a decision he hadn't expected. Finish the job, put another bullet in him, or get out before someone came looking. For the first time, doubt crept into Vince's mind. Killing a cop was already dangerous. Getting caught standing over one was a death sentence. And he had seen it before. Some people, they just wouldn't die, no matter how bad they were hit. Jake Bishop might be one of those people. The sound of distant footsteps snapped him out of it. Someone was coming. Damn it, he muttered. Vince made a choice. He stood, pocketed the wallet, and disappeared into the night. Jake lay there, his body trembling, pain radiating from his chest. His mind was slipping, consciousness fading in and out, but one thought pushed through the haze. He wasn't supposed to survive. Deputy Jake Bishop had been found barely alive, slumped against his truck, blood pooling beneath him. A single gunshot wound to the chest, serious but miraculously, not fatal. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches. As paramedics worked to stabilize him, his eyelids fluttered. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, fighting against the weight of his injuries. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he muttered something before everything went black. It wasn't random. The word sent a ripple through the responding officers. A targeted hit. This wasn't some botched robbery. Someone had wanted Jake dead. Detective Laura Mitchell, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for inconsistencies, knelt beside the bloodstain on the ground. She studied the scene carefully. The way Jake's body had fallen, the placement of the bullet casing, the distinct lack of struggle. Something about it didn't sit right. She turned to Officer Daniels, who was scanning the area with a flashlight. "Robbery, my ass," she muttered. Daniels nodded in agreement. "Wallet's gone, watch too, but look at his truck. Brand new Silverado, keys in his pocket. Who robs a man and leaves a $20,000 vehicle sitting untouched?" Mitchell exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. They weren't after his stuff. They were after him. She stood up, eyes scanning the perimeter. The nearest security cameras were at the front of the bar, but Jake had been shot in the back parking lot. A deliberate choice. Someone knew exactly where to hit him. Out of view, away from witnesses. The investigation began immediately. Officers canvassed the area, questioning the bar's patrons and staff. But no one had seen anything useful. Just Jake, leaving alone, heading toward his truck. No unusual figures, no suspicious vehicles. Inside the bar, the bartender, a gruff man in his 50s, wiped down the counter while giving his statement. "Yeah, Bishop was here. Sat at the end of the bar, barely touched his drink. Seemed distracted." Mitchell pressed further. "Anyone approach him? Talk to him?" "Nah, he kept to himself, checked his phone a lot, though. Seemed like he was waiting for something." That was their first lead. His phone. Within hours, detectives pulled Jake's phone records. Recent calls, messages, anything that could point to who he had been speaking to that night. One number stood out, Jonas Crowley. Mitchell's brow furrowed as she flipped through the records. Crowley had called Jake twice that night, both within an hour before the shooting. And then silence. She turned to Daniels. "How close was he with the sheriff?" Daniels shrugged. "Partners for years. Best friends, if you believe the stories." Mitchell narrowed her eyes. "Then why the hell hasn't Crowley been here yet?" That was the second red flag. At the hospital, Jake remained unconscious, hooked up to machines, fighting to recover. But the words he had managed to get out, it wasn't random, kept replaying in Mitchell's mind. Something was wrong. And they were just getting started. Jake Bishop lay still, heavily sedated, his body battling the trauma he had endured. Standing beside the bed, Sheriff Jonas Crowley wore the mask of a grieving friend. Jake wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be dead. As he reached for Jake's hand, a quiet voice interrupted him. "You look nervous, Sheriff." Detective Laura Mitchell stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, eyes sharp and unblinking. Crowley stiffened, masking his unease with a forced sigh. "Hell of a thing, isn't it?" he said, shaking his head. "I can't believe this happened. Who would do this to Jake?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," she said, her voice measured. "Seems like someone wanted him dead." Crowley nodded, rubbing his face. Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing." She tilted her head slightly. "Where were you that night, Sheriff?" Crowley met her gaze. His expression didn't flinch. "At home, with my wife." Mitchell nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "That's interesting," she said, flipping open a notepad. "Because we pulled phone records." Crowley felt his stomach tighten. "You called Jake twice that night," Mitchell continued. "First at 9:12 p.m., then again at 10:03 p.m. No answer either time. What were those calls about?" Crowley barely hesitated. "Just checking in, seeing if he wanted to grab a drink after shift." Mitchell gave a small smile. "That's odd, because you never actually showed up at Murphy's bar." Crowley forced a casual shrug. "Had a change of plans." Mitchell let the silence stretch between them before finally asking, "And where was your phone around 11:15 p.m.? Crowley frowned. "Like I said, at home." Mitchell nodded again, then pulled something from her pocket, a printed report. "See, that's the thing. Your phone pinged off a tower less than a mile from the crime scene at exactly 11:17 p.m. "That's strange, don't you think?" Mitchell continued. "Because unless your house suddenly moved across town, you weren't home when Jake got shot." Crowley's mind raced. He had to think fast. I must have driven through the area. You know, just patrolling." "Patrolling?" Mitchell echoed. "You were off duty." Crowley clenched his jaw. "Sheriffs don't really get off duty." Mitchell smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's funny, because not a single officer saw you that night. No dash cam footage, no radio calls. No one recalls seeing the sheriff patrolling anywhere near that area." Crowley's throat was dry, his mind spinning. He needed to get out of this conversation before he made a mistake. "Look, Detective, I want to find whoever did this just as much as you do," he said, stepping back. "But if you're trying to accuse me of something—" "Oh, I'm not accusing you, Sheriff," Mitchell said. "Not yet." She let the words linger before turning to the hospital bed. "But Jake's still alive, and if he wakes up, he might have a lot to say." Crowley forced a tense smile. "Let's hope so." As he walked out, Mitchell watched him go. Her gut told her she was right. She just needed the missing piece. While detectives worked to tighten the noose around Crowley, an unexpected break came from a place they didn't expect: the hitman himself. Vince Mercer had kept a low profile in the days following the botched hit. He had ditched the gun, burned his clothes, and avoided his usual hangouts. But no amount of planning could erase the arrogance that had always been his weakness. 3 nights after the shooting, he made a mistake. Inside a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, Vince sat nursing a whiskey, his fingers drumming against the counter. His nerves had started to settle. He figured if the cops had anything on him, they would have come knocking already. So, after a few drinks, his confidence started creeping back. And when a familiar face, a low-level criminal named Danny Harper, slid into the seat next to him, Vince couldn't help but brag. "Man, you wouldn't believe the kind of work I just pulled," Vince muttered, swirling the ice in his glass. Danny smirked. "Yeah? Big payday?" Vince exhaled, nodding. "Let's just say, some people will pay a hell of a lot to make a problem disappear." Danny raised an eyebrow. "What kind of problem?" Vince chuckled. "The kind that wears a badge." It was a careless comment thrown out between drinks. But it was enough, because what Vince didn't know was that Danny, he was an informant. Within hours, Vince was in handcuffs. Jake Bishop wasn't dead, and when he woke up, everything Vince had done would come crashing down. It didn't take long. Faced with a murder charge, Vince cracked, and in a single breath he said the words that changed everything. Jonas Crowley hired me. It was an ordinary morning at the sheriff's department, or at least it seemed that way. Officers were filing in, sipping their coffee, chatting about the latest cases. The air smelled of burnt coffee and printer ink, the usual sounds of keyboards clacking and radios crackling filling the space. Sheriff Jonas Crowley sat at his desk, going through paperwork, his face calm but his mind anything but. The last few days had been tense. He felt the pressure closing in. He wasn't sure how, but he knew the detectives were onto him. Still, he had convinced himself he had time. Time to figure a way out, time to shift the blame, time to make sure Jake never woke up. He was wrong. The front doors swung open. Detective Laura Mitchell walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The entire room fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, officers paused mid-stride. Mitchell didn't hesitate. She walked straight to Crowley's desk. "Sheriff Jonas Crowley," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Crowley looked up, eyes narrowing. "Detective?" he said, forcing a smirk. "What can I do for you?" She didn't return the smile. Instead, she pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and attempted murder," she announced. A heavy silence filled the room. Crowley let out a sharp breath, forcing a laugh. "You're joking." "No," she said flatly. "I'm not." The 2 officers moved in. Crowley's smirk vanished, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you can walk in here and—" One officer grabbed his wrist, yanking it behind his back. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his wrist before he could finish the sentence. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Crowley twisted, trying to shake them off. "You're making a mistake," he barked. "You have nothing on me." Mitchell took a step closer, her voice steady. "Vince Mercer flipped. He told us everything. The hitman you hired is singing like a bird." Crowley froze, his face drained of color. Mitchell continued, her voice low, only for him to hear. "We have your text messages. We have your phone pings near the crime scene. We have a bar full of people who heard Mercer brag about taking out a cop. And we have Jake. He's still alive, Crowley. And when he wakes up, I guarantee you, he'll remember everything." The room was spinning. Crowley's breathing grew shallow. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. The officers hoisted him up, leading him through the bullpen. His own deputies, his men, stared in stunned silence. Some whispered. Others just shook their heads. His reputation, his career, his entire life, ripped away in front of everyone. As they pushed him through the doors and out into the waiting squad car, reporters were already outside, cameras flashing. The story had spread like wildfire. A sheriff arrested for attempting to kill his own deputy, and it was only the beginning. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick as spectators filled every available seat. Reporters lined the back wall, pens scribbling furiously, cameras snapping. The trial had become a media sensation. A sheriff orchestrating a murder-for-hire plot against his own deputy? The headlines practically wrote themselves. At the front of the courtroom, Crowley sat at the defense table, clad in an orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the crisp uniform he had once worn with pride. His lawyer sat beside him whispering strategies, but Crowley barely heard him. He was too busy staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes dark. Across the aisle, Jake Bishop sat in a wheelchair, still recovering from his injuries. His face was pale, his body weak, but his eyes burned with something else. Betrayal. The best friend he had trusted with his life had tried to kill him. And his wife, she had been part of it, whether she knew about the murder plot or not. Veronica sat a few rows behind him, head down, refusing to meet his gaze. She had been questioned for hours, forced to admit to the affair, to every stolen moment with Crowley, to every whispered lie. But in the end, she insisted she had no idea about the plan to kill Jake. The prosecutors laid out the case piece by piece. Text messages between Crowley and the hitman, arranging the deal. Financial records showing a large cash withdrawal days before the shooting. Surveillance footage placing Crowley's car near the crime scene. The hitman's confession, the nail in the coffin. The defense tried to argue that Vince Mercer was lying to save himself, but it wasn't enough. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When they returned, the room was silent as the foreman stood. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of solicitation of murder, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. Crowley didn't flinch. He simply stared ahead, emotionless, as the words sealed his fate. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Jonas Crowley, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jake let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the arms of his wheelchair. It was over. Crowley was led away in handcuffs once again, but this time there was no fight, no protest, no last-minute attempts to talk his way out. He simply walked toward his fate, his head held high, but his life, everything he had built, everything he had fought for, was gone. Veronica Bishop disappeared from public life after the trial. She divorced Jake, packed her bags, and left town, trying to outrun the scandal. But the stain of her betrayal followed her. Jake eventually returned to duty, but things were never the same. The scars, both physical and emotional, never fully healed. As for Jonas Crowley, he spent the rest of his life behind bars, a fallen sheriff, a disgraced man, reduced to nothing but a number in the system he once controlled. If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, inhumanity, abuse to mention a few, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you.